I think the main thing is that we're desperate to get back on track and hopefully go and win the race. So we're all quite grateful that we've only got a couple of days to wait to get back onto the circuit. Did the chassis change affect the cars in any way? The answer to that is no, as you could see by Lewis's confidence in the car that he had on Saturday. It's quite normal for us to swap chassis between drivers. They don't drive the same car all year. And the chassis themselves are components that are very strong, very precisely made, and it's very, very rare that that would introduce any kind of an issue. Why was the W12 lacking pace? Well, it's fair to say in qualifying, Max was on pole by a quarter of a second, and we weren't really able to do that time. Our drivers did good laps, they were clean laps, but most of that was coming from Max on the back straights, very long straight in Ricard, and we were not making enough up in the corners to be able to get any closer. However, on Sunday, you saw that when Lewis took the lead of the race in the first stint, he was actually able to pull a bit of a gap. By the end of the stint, it looked like Max was actually dropping back more than we were. So it was encouraging to see that. And that is a picture that we've seen. If you ignore Baku and Monaco, which are very specific circuits, we've seen this picture at previous races where they're actually a bit ahead on a Saturday in qualifying, but actually when it comes to the race, we're right there with them, or even a fraction quicker in terms of degradation or race pace. Lewis did talk about making a lot of setup changes from Friday night into qualifying. And are there any positives that can come from that? Well, essentially, those changes were adjustments to the mechanical balance. So the roll bars on the car, trying to change how it distributes the load across the four wheels around the lap, and also the aero balance. So using the front wing to try and put more downforce on the front axle, which can make the car more responsive when you turn it into the corners. So those are the basic tools. Now, in terms of the positives, well, as you heard him say in qualifying, he was much happier with the rear end of the car. He could turn in with confidence, he could carry speed, and he didn't feel like it was going to step out when he got into the corners. And that was useful because we've got some direction from that if we have this problem again at another circuit, we know how we can tackle it in future. Why was Valtteri pitted first? Well, we were monitoring a vibration that we started to see relatively early on in the first stint, and that was on the front left corner, and that was getting worse and worse. So we have levels that we consider acceptable to run at on circuit. If we go much beyond that, the vibration can get so bad that not only can the driver not really see, you start to run a risk of damage to the tyre or even damage to the car. So as we approach that limit, we were getting ready to make the stop. The other thing you could see was that it got so bad for Valtteri himself, he was dropping back. And ultimately, that was what triggered the stop. It was earlier than we wanted to, but ultimately it was the only decision that we could make at the time. Why did we not box Lewis the lap after Valtteri? Well, with hindsight, we would have done that. The reality was that we had 3.2 seconds of clear air between Lewis and Max, and that we thought was enough to protect against the undercut. Now, how did Max actually get out in front? Well, there's a couple of areas where we lost a bit of time. However, it wasn't the pit stop. The pit stops themselves were very good. There was a bit that we lost at the back end of the lap and coming into the box with Lewis obviously on older tyres. We also had a bit of wheel spin leaving the pit box itself, which cost a little bit. But ultimately, the issue was that in our tools, the amount of time we thought we needed to protect against the undercut was insufficient, and we'll make sure that we can get correct in future. But as I said, with hindsight, we would have done that. That would have allowed Max to go and offset and be on a more similar strategy to Perez, so he could have still presented a risk end of race, but what we wouldn't have done was given up the lead of the race. Did we consider a two-stop, or was it always going to be a one-stop? Well, it's fair to say that in the meetings that we had on Sunday morning with the drivers, we were thinking it was going to be a one-stop. We also thought we were going to need to do a bit of management. Now, the track on Sunday was quite different. We had some rain before the race, cloud cover remained, and it was much, much cooler. And that meant that the limiting axle went from being the rears, which were the ones that you would have run out of first on Friday, suddenly became the front. It was a much more understeery balance, and it was really damaging that front left tyre. Now, in terms of the conversations during the race, well, with Lewis, the big issue for him on converting to a two-stop was where Sergio Perez was on track. He'd been able to do a much longer first stint. He was on fresh tyres, and Lewis would have needed to overtake him. They did have a speed advantage. His tyres would have still been in pretty good shape, and we were worried that we'd lose a bit of time trying to do that. Now, as you saw with Max, he made the two-stop work, but crucially, when he came up to Sergio, he just moves aside and lets him through, and that isn't a luxury that Lewis would have had. In Valtteri's case, well, the big problem was that, again, because Sergio had been able to offset that first stint, if we'd stopped Valtteri when he'd asked to convert to a two, his tyres would have only been about 5 laps newer than Sergio's. The other thing was that Sergio was on the hard tyre, Valtteri was on the medium, and that was not as quick. So the big concern there was that we would have converted Valtteri's strategy, taken him out of that third place, dropped him into fourth, and there wouldn't have been the tyre life difference for him to be able to attack and pass. And again, like Lewis, he would have had to deal with that straight line speed advantage that the Red Bull held. Would we have had more points if we'd split the strategy between the drivers? Well, I think I explained in the previous answer that converting to a two presented significant risks for them, and certainly for Lewis from P2, he may well have only got back to P2. For Valtteri, it would have pretty much consigned him to that fourth place finish. So that probably wasn't really the issue for us. It's more that with the vibration we triggered the early pit stops that meant the one stop was quite a difficult strategy to carry out. It's possible that we could have instructed the drivers to do a bit more management. That might have meant that we were in a better situation end of race. And obviously, we thought Lewis was safe with that 3.2 second gap. Turned out it wasn't. And if we'd known that, we would have stopped in the lap after Valtteri. So those are really the key areas where we'd look to perform better in future, rather than that simple question of should we have converted to the two-stop. Why didn't we pit Valtteri for fastest lap? Well, you've seen that this is something that we do quite often, because typically either us or a Red Bull has got a free stop and they can take that fourth place with an extra point. We were talking about it and we were ready for it, but when Sergio had passed Valtteri, he'd gone four wheels off track at turn 10, and that was a point that we'd raised with race control, whether it was going off track to actually make the pass and gaining a lasting advantage. Now, while they were contemplating that, and ultimately they decided that no further action was necessary, but in that period, we lost the window where we would have actually had to have stopped Valtteri. If they had given Sergio a 5-second penalty, we would have wanted to be within that 5-second window, and by stopping, we'd drop out. So it was really just unfortunate timing at the end that while those discussions were going on, we missed the point where we would have had to come in and take new tyres. Is it difficult to understand the data post-race when you've got such a short time as we have in the middle of this triple-header sequence? Well, I think the main thing is that we're desperate to get back on track and hopefully go and win the race. So we're all quite grateful that we've only got a couple of days to wait to get back onto the circuit. And in terms of the data, well, we've actually got some pretty good data and some good understanding from the last race. We've also got the simulator where we can do a lot of good work preparing for Austria, and that's going to be going on in the next day or two. But ultimately, it's the same for all the teams. You know, if we had an extra week, we would make use of it. But it's actually quite good fun when you have them coming so thick and fast. It puts a lot of pressure on people, but it does keep it exciting. So we are going to be busy for the next couple of days, but hopefully we can arrive in Austria in a good and well-prepared state. Thank you for all of your questions. We're going to be back in another week's time after the Styrian Grand Prix.